Hello and good morning, everyone. Welcome to British Council iTELL webinar series. And for you to know, this is day 11 of our webinar. We have been doing this for 11 days in a row, marathon, and then involving many teachers, hundreds of participants, most of them from Indonesia. But I believe today is pretty special because I saw some of you coming from outside Indonesia. I saw some teachers coming from Thailand, Sawadika, and from other countries too. I haven't seen other countries than Thailand, I guess. And then today we have a special guest, Steanly. He's going to talk about remote teaching, a survival guide for school teachers. I think this is the kind of topic that we've been waiting for. All teachers are surviving with this emergency remote teaching due to this COVID pandemic. And then I believe that we can discuss many things later with Graham. But before we start, let's see if Pajati is here. So this is the collaboration between iTELL, Indonesia Technology Enhanced Language Learning, with British Council Indonesia. I'm going to pass the microphone to Pak Jati first to explain a little bit about what is iTELL. Hopefully Pak Jati is ready. Let's see. Pak Jati, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay. Can you tell us a bit about iTELL, Pak? Because I believe there are some new participants today.
Okay, iTELL was established 2016 with the first conference. Initially, iTELL was only 7 of us thinking of technology and language learning. How should we help the teachers and so on and so on. So we start thinking of having a seminar. So we had a seminar the first time, only around 200 participants, and then we put that into a formal organization or community. Then we have been working on that mostly through social media, sharing apps, discussing about practical things, a lot of practical things. Then 2018, we had the second seminar. It was in Solo. Then the last time it was in Bogor, just before the virus epidemic. Group of teachers, group of young teachers mostly. Usually I'm become the oldest there. Talking about practical things, sharing, and a lot of apps, methodology, and we run a workshop mostly for teachers. Lately, we are working with the British Council to run this joint seminar, webinar. The initiative, it was from iTELL. We start thinking of how can we reach teachers. Then if we use Zoom, it's only 100 participants, a limited number with the free Zoom and so on. So I contacted CALM, and then CALM with the good initiative give us the to use the British Council webinar platform, and we can reach up to 1,000. The first time we launched that together, that was around, I think, 700 participants. But mostly will be attended by definitely more than 300 people will participate with this. That's a short about iTELL. You can have a look at our website on that. Back to Finn.
Well, since you mentioned Pak Kom, our beloved partner, especially in this webinar series, I would like to call upon Pak Kom to explain something probably about our collaboration, the iTELL collaboration with iTELL and this initiative. Hand it to you, Pak Kom.
Okay, thanks very much, Fanita, and good morning to everybody across East Asia. Ramadan Kareem to everybody, all the Muslims that are celebrating the first day of Ramadan. I know that we've got many teachers from across Indonesia with us this morning, but also teachers, English teachers from other countries in East Asia. My colleagues Poom in Thailand, I know that she's been promoting this webinar to teachers in Thailand, and Davide in Vietnam, and other colleagues across East Asia. So welcome everybody. I want to especially thank Finita and Pat Jati, who you've just heard from, who are our close partners in our English work here in Indonesia. And we're really pleased to be able to be working with them on this initial series of webinars to support teachers in these very challenging times. So we're here this morning for the 11th webinar, and we're delighted that we have a British Council expert who's joining us actually from not East Asia, but is actually in Mexico, and it's not even Friday in Mexico, it's Thursday night. So we're very lucky that Graham Steanly is still awake and still up. And I think I'm going to hand back to Finita to hand over to Graham, and we can get started with today's webinar. But thank you very much for joining us. We will be recording this webinar, so you'll get a copy of that afterwards, and we'll be sharing Graham's slides. Okay, Finita.
Okay, thank you, Pak Kom. So before we start, I believe everybody's so eager to listen to Graham. And I just know that you are broadcasting from Mexico. What time is it in Mexico, Graham? Is it night?
It's 10 o'clock at night at the moment in Mexico City.
Whoa.
On Thursday.
You are really on the other side of the world. It's good that we can get connected and talking about something similar for facing this global pandemic. But before we start, I would like to remind everybody that when you want to greet the other participants or just want to give comments, you can put it on the chat box, but don't forget to set the recipient to all panelists and attendees. And also, if you have specific questions directed to Graham or probably to Pak Jati and Pak Kom, which will be discussed later, you can put it in the Q&A chat box. Down there under your screen, below your screen, you can see the chat box and Q&A box. So without further ado, I would like to call upon Graham Steanly to start your presentation. The microphone is yours.
Many thanks, Finita. Thank you to iTELL, and thanks to the British Council, to Colin, for inviting me. I hope you can all hear me okay. It's a long way away. Mexico is, as Finita said, the other side of the world. What I'm going to be doing today is talking to you about my experience with remote teaching, in particular as it refers to school teaching. Teachers of schools. Of course, schools all over the world are becoming more creative in developing solutions to keep students learning because of the multiple school closures and the general disruption caused by COVID-19. Many, if not most, of the solutions that have been developed rely upon technology to deliver some form of remote online learning or teaching. And in this webinar, I'll present ideas and advice for school teachers, particularly for those who find themselves having to teach remotely and who are new to it. First of all, a little bit more about me. I'm the British Council's English for Educational Systems lead in the Americas. Previously, I was working in Uruguay for the British Council as country director, helping to manage the delivery of weekly English lessons through video conferencing to between 75,000 and 100,000, depending on the year, primary state school students. So let me move on. So if you are interested in what I have to say today, then you can download more information in particular about our experience in Uruguay and the Americas of remote teaching. We have many years of experience, the British Council, in delivering remote classes to students all over the world. In Uruguay, as I said, we've been working in partnership with an organization called Plan Sabal with the Ministry of Education there to cater for the lack of trained and qualified English language teachers in the country. managing remote teaching of the primary school, primary children. And as a result of that, I edited a remote language teaching book of research papers and case studies, which was published in 2019 and available to download from the British Council's Teaching English website. I think although the remote teaching we do on the Sabal in English or Sabal English project is different because the children are usually all together in a classroom with a local classroom teacher present, some of the chapters, for example, those listed on the slide here, are very relevant to teaching children remotely when they're based at home. So, what is remote teaching? Well, for me, remote teaching is the practice of synchronous teaching. In other words, live online, a bit like what we're doing now. I'm speaking to you live online through video conferencing, through tools such as Zoom. There are lots of other tools which you can use as well. It's usually combined with other online learning and teaching, asynchronous learning and teaching. That is done through email, for example, or using a learning management system, such as Moodle or Edmodo or Schoology or lots of other different types. What I'm going to be talking to you today, though, is about the synchronous remote teaching aspect of online learning and teaching. I think there is a very big difference between emergency remote teaching and planned remote teaching. As Hodges, Moore, Lockey, Trust and Bond mentioned this year in a very interesting article I recommend you read called The Difference Between Emergency Remote Teaching and Online Learning, well-planned online learning experiences are meaningfully different from courses offered online responses in response to a crisis or disaster, such as the current pandemic. Emergency remote teaching is the ability to quickly adapt to teaching online due to some kind of external force. And I'll be looking at that, but also how you can move away from that towards a more considered, well-planned, well-thought-of remote teaching as well. The other thing I'd like to draw your attention to before we get started is a concept that was developed by Stephen Bax, a UK academic, in 2003, which is this concept of normalization. Now, Stephen Bax said that the objective of using any learning technology should be to achieve something he called normalization, which means really that the technology should, as far as possible, disappear into the background, to become invisible. Really what you're trying to achieve when you use technology, when you're remote teaching, is really this connection between the teacher and the learners and the learners. So the technology really should be unobtrusive, and if it can disappear into the background, then so much the better. So that is the objective, I think. Now, some of you, I'm not sure how many, will have just started remote teaching. It will be very new for you. Others will be thinking of it. And then there'll be others who have quite a lot of experience of it, I think, today. Now, what I would like to do is just share with you 3 slides with some tips for people who are just getting started in remote teaching. And these are some suggestions and advice for you if that is your case. So for those people for whom remote teaching is new, I think the first thing to do for me is to start small and to start with what you know. You shouldn't overcomplicate things. Don't let yourself become overwhelmed with platforms and tools and resources. Nowadays, there are so many tips and links and articles about what you can do, what you should be doing, that it can feel often too much for teachers. It can be overwhelming. Now, I think the most important thing is that you know how to teach. So you should start by doing what you would do more or less in the classroom, and then adjust things as you become familiar with the tools that you're using and as the students become comfortable. Like in your face-to-face class, I think establishing a routine and making sure that students know the routine is important. The sooner everyone becomes familiar with the online platform, for example, and the situation, the better. Make sure students know what is expected of them and what is going to happen in the class. And then I think it's very important, if you're remote teaching, for you to familiarize yourself with the platform that you're going to be using, know how to deal in particular with security issues. There's been a lot recently in the press about Zoom, for example, and the problems. I've been using Zoom for years without any real problems. I think what you do need to know is how to deal with the technicalities of Zoom, the security, how to deal with people who are undesirable if they get into the platform, etc. How to mute, how to unmute students, how to give and deny access, etc. And really become familiar with the tools. If you are familiar with the tools, then I don't think you'll have a problem. More tips for getting started with remote teaching. Once you have started, I think what you need to do is get feedback from the learners. Find out what worked from them, what didn't work, what did they find interesting, what did they find useful. Involve them in the experience and pay attention to their opinion. You'll become a better teacher from this, and the students will learn more. Now, I think also you shouldn't have to feel that you have to stick to something if you've started using it, for example, and it isn't working. Be prepared to radically change if necessary. Be flexible in what you do. I think the students will be very forgiving, because this, for most of them, will be a new experience for them as well. And once you're comfortable with the platform, with how it works, etc., don't be afraid to try new things. Experiment, be creative. Use the unique online aspect of what you're doing to do things that you wouldn't usually do, or maybe you couldn't do in the classroom. An example is using an online background. Now, I'm using at the moment a very simple black background, but there are all sorts of backgrounds that if we have time at the end, I can show you a few. And you can experiment, and not only Zoom has this, but tools such as Teams and others can do that as well. Right, and then finally, for getting started, I think you should use this as an experiment. It's an opportunity to experiment and really try not to give remote teaching a negative spin. It may be temporary, it may not be what you're used to or what the students are used to, but I think it's very important to create a good, positive atmosphere for learning. That way, the students will be very receptive and will learn the language, which is ultimately what we want them to do. It also helps if you're enjoying yourself, and students can tell. So I think you need to be comfortable. You need to remove distractions from the place where you're teaching. If you're teaching from home, for example, try and isolate yourself, try and keep away from distractions, other people, noise, etc. And try and have a bit of fun and make sure the students are having fun too. And that way they will learn a lot more than if you don't do that. Okay, now, one thing that I find is particularly important if you're teaching school children, be they primary or secondary school children, is child protection. And we at the British Council have a particular focus upon this. We think it's very important to make sure that the children are safe when they are learning. There are lots of things you can do to help this, and here's some ideas on the screen. Now, what you may find, which is very different to the situation you teach in when you're teaching at a school, in a classroom, is that you may, with the students based at home, you may find that there's an adult, a parent or guardian in the room during the class. Now, this can be a good thing, or if it causes disruption, it can be less than good. I think what you need to do is make sure that the parent or guardian in the class doesn't disrupt during the class. You probably also have more contact with parents as you're teaching students who are based at home. I would suggest that if you can, ask or rely upon your school to help you with the parents and make sure that their expectations about what can be expected through this kind of teaching are met and they're realistic. I think you shouldn't also feel, you shouldn't feel, and the teacher shouldn't feel, and the school shouldn't feel like you should be connected all the time with the students. The teacher does not need to be there all the time with this type of teaching. There are some things that students can do on their own. And in fact, there are things that are better that students are asked to do on their own, more so than when at school. And also very important, remember to have breaks. So things that can help you if you are related to teaching, the remote teaching with child protection, is become familiar with the technology. You need to restrict access to tools such as screen sharing, the whiteboard, the microphones, cameras, etc. You can give access to students who need this at the time, and you can also restrict the access until you know that only the students that you've invited are in the actual classroom. That will avoid the kind of problems that we've been seeing in the press sometimes with tools such as Zoom when links are made public. Now, you do need to become aware and familiar with the tools so you know how to eject unwanted guests. Now, I've only ever, in the hundreds and hundreds of sessions that I've taken place, that I've participated in with Zoom, I've only ever experienced one example where I've had an unwanted guest there and had to eject them. And it wasn't a big problem because I was very familiar with the tools and knew how to do it. So they didn't cause much of a disruption. So I think it's very unlikely that will happen, but you need to be aware of what to do to cause embarrassment or disruption if it does happen. What you can do also is invite students via registered emails. And also, I think I would recommend you talk to students about their online behavior. They should be behaving online as they would in the classroom, things like netiquette, etc. And don't make things like the links to online classes public. If you can password protect the classes, so much the better. This was password protected for me, for example. And then also when it comes to the learning management system, if you moderate their online activity that students are doing and making sure that everything is going to plan, so much the better. Right, now on to general technology tips. And as Vinita said, I'll be answering questions that you have. Any questions that you have, if you post them in the Q&A box, I'll be taking those and answering them at the end. Hopefully there'll be some that aren't answered by what I have to say from now on. So general technology tips. First off, I think what you need to do is test the audio. You need ideally to hold a short 20 to 30 minute session when the main purpose is to check the students can all hear and speak using the technology. Now this could be the first part of your first remote class, or it can be done separately. If individuals have problems during this check, I think what you need to do is contact them individually to work through the problems and sort it out, rather than disrupting the class for everyone. What you should do is to try and avoid the kind of situations where you have people who are hanging around, they're faffing about, the teacher's faffing about the technology, trying to get it to work for one student when it works for everybody else. That's very disruptive to the learning. I think the other thing you need to do is mute everybody on entry when you start the remote class, and encourage students to mute when not speaking. You can mute them if there are particular problems with background noises, etc., or feedback, which sometimes happen. As the host of the remote session, as the teacher, you should be able to mute everybody and give access to the mic as necessary. I think the other thing you can do is you can plan your warmer and other parts of the lesson to gradually introduce features of the online platform that you want students to use. Things like whiteboard tools, breakout rooms, the features of the learning management system, etc. If you gradually introduce them, then students will become more and more familiar with them, and then very shortly you'll be using them very well together. I would also suggest to use cameras as much as you can. If connectivity does allow the students to use the webcams all the lesson, then do so. If it doesn't, then at least try to start the lesson by everybody seeing each other and the students seeing you, for example, and try to finish with them as well. If you can do that, that makes things a lot more human. I think we do need as humans to see each other when we're speaking if we can. It does make a big difference. If you can't do, then what I would do is try and get students to turn on the webcam when they're speaking and then turn it off. If that isn't possible, then just deal with the, use the class with just the voice, but it is better if you can use the webcams. The other thing I think I would recommend is to have a back channel open with students in case connectivity fails. Now, what is a back channel? It's another form, another way of connecting with students. So it may be another chat in another platform. So if, for example, we're using Zoom and Zoom fails, well, you can always fall back on using the chat in the learning management system. In particular, this platform, if you have it to use. I think you do need to make sure the students know that if you drop out of the class for whatever reason, maybe your connectivity fails or somebody else's does, one of the students, then you know how you can get in touch with them quickly through email, through the chat in the LMS, etc., to tell them what to do next. And I think if you do have access to the platform LMS that you're using, then this is probably the best place to do. You're probably already doing asynchronous activities with them anyway. I would consider flipping the classroom. What do I mean by that? I'm sure some of you have heard of that, but some of you may not have. I think you need to take some of the things that take up a lot of time that you would normally do in a face-to-face classroom, but doing it in a remote environment and perhaps not the best use of your time as a teacher. Now, you don't really want to be connected with students and you be waiting 10 minutes, 20 minutes while they do a reading or a writing or even a listening. Now, some of the listening, if you try to do it live online, can be very problematic because of the connection, especially if it's a video, for example. So if you can get the students to do that before the class or after the class, then this will work much better. The other thing you need to do is have a plan B available. A plan B, in other words, an alternative if connectivity fails. Now, what I would suggest is have available some instructions that you can send students via chat, via email, so they can work independently or even synchronously in pairs or groups or individually if you cannot all connect together. The lowest common denominator, of course, for synchronous live remote teaching is chat. And we're using the chat here quite a lot. And I think, if you can at least have tasks prepared and an ability to get students to connect to you in the chat, that can work as well. It used to be the only way that this used to be able to be done online. I think you also need to set rules for behavior and the expectations of the students at the beginning and enforce them. You shouldn't let students share links to potential Zoom bombers, for example, which has been the case, particularly with certain teenagers thinking it's fun to get people to come in and disrupt the class. I think what you need to do is have this mutual feeling of respect. They respect you, you respect them. That expectation of what students should or can do in class is very important. I think it's also very important that you promote the students to take more responsibility for their own learning. And this is a very good opportunity for you to do so. And in the end, this will help them a lot. If you can, I recommend you record the session. Now, I know that's quite difficult sometimes because you probably should get permission from the students, from parents, and that can be time consuming, difficult to get. It can take some time, but in the end, it will be very worthwhile if you can do it for all sorts of different reasons. You can use the recordings of the students to assess them, to assess their speaking, for example. So you don't have to worry so much about noting down how the speaking is of the students. You could revisit the recording of the class afterwards. So that's one thing you can do. You can also share your recording with peers. So other teachers can benefit from seeing you teach the recording of the teaching that you do. And you can also benefit from seeing recordings of their teaching. You can learn so much from observing another teacher teaching remotely, that it's worth its weight in gold. You can also use the recordings to assess your own teaching. One of the best things I ever did was record one of my young learner classes and sit down with a more experienced teacher and look at what I was doing right and what I wasn't doing so right. And you can also reflect on your own teaching if you have time to do that. You could also make the recordings available for students who can't attend the live class, which would be very useful, I think, for them to do. The students who do attend can also revisit the classes, and then also snippets of the class could be used for continuing professional development sessions in the future with the teachers. You could either lead a session on that, or you could hand over the recordings to someone else who could do it. I think you really should not be afraid of recording lessons. As I said before, they're worth their weight in gold, but you do need to be very honest and upfront with the students and with the parents of the students if you have young learners about what you plan to do with them, how you're going to use them. And I would stay away from making them available, for example, publicly on sites such as YouTube. If you are going to post them on video sharing sites, then put a password on and be careful about who has access to that. Right, some general remote teaching tips for you now. When you're teaching remotely, I think what you need to do is prioritize outcomes. Generally, everything takes longer to do than in a face-to-face classroom. And so you won't be able to meet the same outcomes. So you'll need to prioritize. You need to identify, I think, what can be given and what should be read or listened to, etc., before the class by the students to save the valuable synchronous time that they have with you. As I said before, flipping the classroom is a good idea if you can get it to work. If you're using a course book or materials designed for face-to-face classes, then you should look very carefully before the class starts to work out what can be used without adaptation and what needs to be redesigned or adapted for the remote teaching class. You should keep also instructions very simple and limit the tools that you use at first. You can gradually increase these to have the lessons more sophisticated when the students are comfortable, and when you yourself are comfortable with the tools. You can introduce things such as breakout rooms and other things such as role playing, etc., after a few sessions. Breakout rooms, for those people who haven't heard of them, are a way of being able to separate students to go to separate virtual rooms so they can work in pairs or small groups. And you as a teacher can then go into those virtual rooms in turn and monitor what the students are doing. But in order for them to work well, you do really need to be very clear about what you want the students to do when they are there, because you won't physically be there or even virtually be there, and you need to go around. It might take you some time to get to them. I think the other thing you should do is don't feel like you need to be sitting all the time. In this type of environment, webinar, it's the best way of doing it. So I'm not going to be standing up and moving around. But in a class where you want a lot more interaction to happen, you don't want the remote teaching session or lesson to be you just talking to the students. You want the students to talk to each other. You want to talk to them. They want to talk to you, etc. You want this kind of group dynamic interaction going on. You can help that by moving around and encourage the students to do so, especially if you're meeting for a long time. You know, if you're meeting for 30, 40 minutes, then the student should be moving around at some point. You can do all sorts of things to get that happening for valid reasons. For example, if you're teaching food vocabulary, why not ask them to go to the fridge to get hold of something out of the fridge, or a piece of food from the kitchen, or something, make it a race, make it fun, all sorts of things you can do there. I think you need to plan and vary interaction patterns. So ask for answers in the chat if they're quick responses and students can do it quite easily. This is also a very good way to see if students are paying attention, because if you are teaching online and you don't have the students with their webcams on, you're not exactly sure if they're actually paying attention or if they're actually even physically present at the computer while you're teaching. You can check on this by asking for responses and see which of the students don't respond. They're the ones who are not paying attention, and then you can deal with that. You should think very carefully about the tools the students will use during the lesson. Are they going to write on a whiteboard? Do you want them to share their screen, share something, a presentation or a website? Are they going to present to you? Make sure that you show them how to use those tools if you're all going to use them. And also just give them access when they need to have access, not access all of the time, which can be distracting. You don't want them to interfere with what you're doing on the screen, for example. You don't want them to start annotating the slides, etc. That will waste your valuable time. If you're using the breakout rooms, then you need to know, you need to make sure that everybody has knows what to do there, and it's a good idea to post instructions into the chat and go quickly from one room to another to make sure that the students know what they're doing and that they're on task. You could also use Realia. So you have a camera here. That camera doesn't have to just be pointed at you. You can show all sorts of things. Here's a highlighter. Here's a Swiss Army knife. You can also zoom in and zoom out with the camera. You can go off screen. You could use puppets, all sorts of things you can do with cameras. That just a little bit of imagination and creativity will, and you'll come up with all sorts of things to be able to use things relevant to your lesson. If you're using Zoom or Teams or some of the tools, as I said before, you can also change the background. Now, I think keeping a simple background for most of the lesson is probably a good thing. I've got a screen up here with a black background because I don't want you focusing on my untidy room that is behind me here. I want you just to focus on me and what I'm trying to tell you. So let's move on now to some ideas for engaging students, looking at what you can do to really get them to pay attention and get them motivated in the teaching that you do. Now, I'm going to ask you to write some of these into the chat. The first one, the missing word, we have E something contact and S something presence. What's the missing word? Can you type into the chat what you think the word is? E and Mawati. I hope I pronounced that right. Says I. You were the first to answer, yes. So it's eye contact and S presence. Eye contact and what is the S? Social? No. Pospita? No, not social. It's something else. It's something that we're all looking at the moment. What are we looking at the moment? A screen. Yes, Harawati. Very good. Yeah, we're all looking screen. So eye contact and screen presence. What about the next one? Don't just be a TH. At the moment, I'm just a TH. I'm the H and the T teacher now. What am I actually doing now? My H is T, talking, exactly. Don't be just a talking head. The next thing is be something, I think that's an I. Any idea? U of V, any ideas? I'm not going to go through them one at a time, but write in if you think you can guess any of these. Be interactive, exactly, Preetha. U of V, be interesting. You could be interesting as well. Yeah, very good, Kellyanne. MD, use of the C. BF with the T, and trouble. So I won't delay this anymore. Let me go to the answers. So we have eye contact and screen presence. Don't be just a talking head. Body language. I thought that was an I. Be interactive, could have been one there. use of voice, minimize distractions, use of the camera, be familiar with the technology, and troubleshooting. I'm going to look at these in turn. So eye contact and screen presence. Now, how can you establish eye contact with students when teaching remotely? Well, if you look directly into the camera lens, that's how you can do that. Now, for most of the time, if you have a laptop with a built-in camera lens, then you'll be looking as if you're looking at the camera, in which case you're establishing eye contact with the students. I'm looking at the camera directly now. I'm looking at my screen here. Now, if you have a plug-in webcam, for example, then that might not be the case. What you need to do is make sure that the webcam is at eye level and that you actually look into it during the class. I have got a separate screen over here. If I was looking at my slides, I would be doing this, and you probably notice the difference if I'm looking at my slides to when I'm looking in the camera, and that is establishing eye presence, so eye contact. You also need to think about how you present yourself on the screen. I've already talked about the background, what you wear, how you are, and also how you occupy the screen. What you don't want to do is be in a situation where only part of your body or face is being shown on the screen. Students will find that very distracting, and they probably won't be concentrating on what you have to say if you do that. So these things are very important. One of the things that helps with screen presence is the way you light yourself. I've taken particular care to turn off the overhead light here, which would actually cause glare here. And if I had natural light, I would put myself the laptop with the window behind the laptop. What I have is a lamp, but I don't have the lamp shining directly at me. I have it reflecting off a wall. These things are all very worthwhile thinking about. You don't want to be in shadows. You want to be well lit, but you don't want a light directly pointing at you, because you'll be very hot and uncomfortable then, and you'll start sweating. So you need to think about these things. And it'll make you feel more comfortable. And the more comfortable you are, the better the class will be. So these are all things that I think you need to take into account. Don't be just a talking head. Now, I'm just a talking head tonight, or this morning for you. But if you want, what you should really think about is you want to make your lesson, just as a face-to-face lesson, be memorable. You want people to remember what you say, what you show. And so if you're just a talking head, and that's the case every single time you do a lesson, then it'll all blur together and people won't remember this. What you really need to do is have students remember what you say to them. Make the experience enjoyable and memorable. If you stand up, if you walk around, if you take yourself away from the screen sometimes, if you use certain props, if you start the lesson with a silly hat, all sorts of different things, then these can be little things that don't take up a lot of time, but make things memorable for the students. Now, you may well not be able to move your camera, but what you can do is you can move your body. I can zoom out, or I can zoom in by moving my face and body nearer to the camera or away from it. I could also, if I'm teaching pronunciation, actually move my mouth nearer to the camera so students can actually see what I'm pronouncing. Building group work, building pair work, and remember, just because you're teaching online, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't give students the same amount of time to speak or work in pairs or in groups as you would do normally if you were teaching face-to-face. It's very important for them to interact with each other. Body language. So now this is one I always forget to do, in particular when I'm doing webinars. You can't move around the classroom as a remote teacher, but you can use body language in different ways. You can exaggerate gestures and face expressions, And if you don't do that, then they'll be lost on students, particularly if they're looking at very small screens. You can gesticulate, use mannerisms, your posture, and your stance to convey confidence or shyness, etc. when needed. You can role play and activate. Gestures in particular, I think, should be very confident and clear when you're teaching live online. Students won't capture small or subtle gestures, so you need to exaggerate, which might seem unnatural to you at first, but you'll soon get the hang of it, I think. You should also smile, not a forced smile. You don't want to scare your students, but what you do want is for students to see that you are feeling good, and that will encourage them to have a positive feeling about your lesson as well. These are all things that you probably already do in the face-to-face classroom, but sometimes you can forget about these things when you're teaching in a different modality such as online. So it's worth mentioning, I think. Vary your facial expressions, and then you'll better capture your students' attention. Use of voice also is very important. Your voice is one of the most valuable assets you have to create a mood, an atmosphere, and transmit emotions. Now, you may not be aware of how you speak or what your voice sounds like, and that it can have an impact on learning outcomes. But if your students feel that your voice is patronizing, too loud, too soft, or monotonous, then they may respond negatively. In particular, you want students to be able to hear you without straining, and you do need to insist on that and check each lesson, I think. On the other hand, if your voice is expressive and lively, then I think you will draw their attention, and it's more likely that the students will remember what you have to say, they'll be engaged and motivated. What other aspects of your voice should be concerned about when you are teaching remotely? Well, varying the volume, so speaking softer or louder, depending on what you're doing or what you're trying to transmit, will help you control the class. And classroom management at a distance is a big challenge when teaching remotely. Changing the tone of your voice is the best way to convey a mood or emotion. You can lower or or make higher the pitch of your voice. Vary the pitch and you'll seem more interesting to your students. And the pace, so you can talk faster or more slowly. And if you vary the way that you speak, then you will engage students a lot more than if you don't do it. So you do need to take that into account. I've already said it before, you need to minimize distractions when you're teaching online. And you want your students to minimize distractions as well. You would like them to be in a space that doesn't have a lot of background noise, a lot of things going on, so they are not distracted by looking out the window, what's happening at the door or in the other room, or someone in the room, preferably they'll be on their own if that's possible, or with a parent or guardian who is quietly reading would be a good thing to do. You yourself should minimize the opportunities for distraction. Make sure that the people that you're living with in the house know that when you're teaching you shouldn't be disturbed for whatever the reason, and again the background shouldn't be too busy. If, for example, there were books behind me, you might find that students are trying to read the titles of the books rather than concentrate on my class. Talk a little bit about that, about using realia to illustrate vocabulary, etc. With a webcam that you can move, like I have a webcam that is attached to my camera, and I can actually move it around. I can show you my room, and you can see why it's so messy, why I have a background there. Distractions. So you can do that. If you can't do that, as I said before, you will have to move. But if you can invest in a plug-in microphone and plug-in camera, then it can be a good way of doing it. The other thing you could do is you can log into your class with with your mobile, with a tablet or another computer if you have one, and have a second camera, which you can use as a visualizer. So I could use that second camera to point at things like a book or whatever and focus upon that if I wanted to. I think the other things that you can do is have a small portable whiteboard to vary things, use puppets with students, or other things that you could think of to teach. Be familiar with the technology. I've already said you should know what you're doing with the technology, and you should have everything that you want to use open. So you shouldn't be faffing around trying to open and waiting for websites to open. Beforehand, use everything, get everything ready, so you don't waste time doing that. And then the troubleshooting, which I've talked about, having a plan B. You do need to know the basics of how you can get things working again if things fail. What you should do before you start a class, I think, is to restart your computer. You may have had lots of things happening, lots of processes going on, lots of things open on the computer. What you don't want to do is have all those things open, taking up your resources of the computer or hogging bandwidth or connectivity before you start teaching. I would suggest that you restart the computer and then just open the things that you need for the actual class before each class. You'll find it makes a big difference. And that's that. Now, when you do move on from the initial beginnings of remote teaching and want to know more, there are lots and lots of places that you can find out more. This is a book that I wrote a chapter for that was published this year, which if you're a member of iTEFL Learning Technologies Special Interest Group, for example, you can get it for free. If not, then it is available to buy. It is a chapter looking at how remote teachers need to develop and what it is that makes a good remote teacher. I've got a few of the selections from this chapter here. I'm not going to go through them in detail. Later, if you're interested in looking at them more detail, then you can look at the slides, which I will make available for all of you, so you can look at the links and these things. But I think one of the good things about the findings that we did through observations, surveys, and questionnaires with teachers is that most of what makes a good remote teacher is what makes a good teacher anyway, particularly of young learners. There are two aspects I think that you need to take into particular account if you're teaching on, which goes without saying, that becomes more important for you to develop and become more competent and confident with. And the other thing is classroom management. Classroom management at a distance, if you have students working from home. Those are things that you really need help with and to focus upon. Here's the second slide of remote teacher tips. I'm coming to the end now and I'm going to be taking questions. Just to tell you that there is a survey that is available, and the British Council are trying to find out what it is that teachers need this survey. And some of you may have already answered the questions in this crisis. They're doing that so we can provide more resources, more training, more tips, except for teachers that are very much directed at what their needs are. So I recommend that you do take the survey if you can to tell us about that. It would be very helpful, I think. Then there are all sorts of other resources and places that you can go to. The British Council's Teaching English website has lots of links to useful resources and tips. There's a series of webinars there. I know this is the 11th of the webinars that you're holding, so you probably have enough, but in case you do want more, there are lots there, and there are recordings if you don't have time now, which you can go and visit later. There's a course, a very good course run by FutureLearn about becoming an online teacher, which I recommend. It's not strictly speaking for language teachers, but the other thing, it's got some very good tips, and it also puts you in touch with educators who are also sharing their own ideas and solutions. And then finally, there is a resource that iTELL Learning Technology SIG has made available to everybody. You can publicly download it. It's lots of interviews with people who are very experienced with remote teaching and other forms of teaching online. And they have shared their experience very generously in lots of interviews, which you may find of use. And you can download that from the iTELL Learning Technologies SIG webpage. And that brings me to the end. This was an article where I got some of the ideas I presented today. That is online, and that brings me to the end. So I think, Finita, you've been monitoring the questions. If you'd like to let me know which ones you think I haven't answered, I'd be happy to answer them.
All right, I was trying to categorize, like there are 26 questions and some of them have been answered related to very technical things. So questions are related to students' behavior, suggestion on tools, how to manage students' motivations, problems that teachers face, and also teaching techniques. I would like to start with common problems that teachers face, especially in Indonesia, and I think also in some countries in Southeast Asia, about the low internet connection, low access, or even zero access to technology. Do you have any suggestion on low tech or any tools that can be accessed for teachers with low access to internet and technology?
Yes, of course. This kind of situation is really demonstrating how important it is to have an internet connection these days. If you know, and a lot of it's such a shame that this is not something that is more readily accessible and available to all students or all people really, because it does exacerbate the digital divide. What I've done today is really concentrate on how to teach when you do have an internet connection. There are other ways of dealing with students when that isn't possible. You can try and find the lowest common denominator, as I said. Perhaps students have mobile phones, in which case you can use certain apps, perhaps like WhatsApp, to teach. There's even teaching through SMS. When that isn't possible, then there are other offline ways you can teach, of course. They're more complicated because you do need to get resources to students. You could get students, you know, paper photocopies, of course, are possible. There are some countries where teaching through radio or teaching through TV has been adopted. So these are all, in Mexico, for example, teaching through TV has become very popular because internet access isn't possible in a lot of situations, a lot of states with a lot of populations. Really, it would take another type of webinar. What I would do is try to locate someone who has expertise, particularly in teaching in low tech context, to give a webinar on that, because I think there are lots of things you can do. I'm not particularly an expert on it. Maybe Colm knows someone who would be able to provide help with that.
Okay, thank you, Graham, for the answer. Colm, would you like to add something about this? You are still mute, Colm.
Thanks very much, Finita. This is why I'm not giving the digital technology webinar myself at all. I'm still learning, like many of our teachers. And this question about how to teach, you know, low-tech solutions is a question that's come up a lot and in our chat today. And I think Graham's absolutely right that we're seeing now that this situation is causing a greater divide, unfortunately, between people who have access to internet, a strong internet connection, and people who also have the tools, laptops and computers, are able to cope maybe a little bit more easily than others. So we are looking at a different variety of different ways in which the sort of teaching can continue in these without those tools. And here in Indonesia, I know it's great that the Ministry of Education has a daily schedule of television programs on national television. And I know that the innovative teachers here are using WhatsApp a lot to send materials. They're recording short sort of lesson instructions and sending those via email and by WhatsApp. And I think, as we go through this together, none of us have the answers right now, but there is real innovation coming from people in these situations. And I think tomorrow, Finita, we have one of your experts, an iTELL speaker, Daniel, who is going to be giving a session about this. And he's been collecting examples of people teaching in low-tech rural areas. Is that right?
Yes, exactly. Tomorrow, Daniel will be talking about showcasing the teaching materials from offline to online. So shifting from offline to online. Probably you can also join the webinar for tomorrow. Well, off the topic a little bit, Bram, this is heated in our chat box. Everyone's talking about the security of Zoom. Probably you can have a brief explanation about this.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think there's a lot of scare stories about Zoom. Now, there are so many different types of them that it's difficult to sort of just summarize. But I think most of the cases where things have gone wrong with people on Zoom have been ones or etc. In Zoom rooms haven't been very particularly with the actual tools themselves. So as I said earlier, I think what you need to do is you really need to limit access to things like screen sharing, the whiteboard, microphones, videos, to people that you trust. So I would, as a teacher, for example, I would mute everybody when they come in, don't have them, their webcams turned on, invite only students that I know and have them register, have a password. Don't make there are lots of things here, but don't make the link publicly available. And also be familiar with the technology. You need to know how to kick someone out of a room. Don't make anyone else the host. So you would be the host, in which case you have controls to mute everybody. You can decide, you have all access to all the security things. You do need to be aware of them, and you need to be aware of the possibility. I did say that I've used Zoom every day now for maybe about 4 years. And I've only had one single incident of a Zoom bomber, as they're called. And that was in a public webinar where we were trying to get equal access. We wanted to give the people who were attending the webinar, it was like a workshop, access to the camera, the screen, the whiteboard, and the chat, the mics, etc. And that's where the danger comes. When you don't really know well who is in the room with you, when you're making the link available publicly, or there are cases where students have mischievously given the link to other people who have come in and caused disruptions. That's happened in the last couple of days. There was an article in the newspaper, the UK newspaper, The Guardian today about, sorry, the BBC, I think it was today, about incidences where that has happened. And I think the problem there is really partly down to the fact that the people running the event, they weren't really very careful about the tools and using them. And they didn't really know what they were doing by giving access to everybody. If you have that in mind and are security conscious, and there are lots of different articles where you can read about advice of what you should and shouldn't do, now with Zoom, then I think there'll be no problems.
All right. Thank you very much for the explanation. Hopefully it can make the participant feel a bit safer. Now I will move on to another questions related to teaching techniques. Some of them were asking about how to reach more students with who have different ability, or even in the inclusive teaching situation. Do you have any suggestion for this?
You mean, well, if I understand the question correctly, it's a question of teaching very large groups.
Yeah, different level.
Is that right?
Teaching different
A
level of ability.
differentiation.
Yeah. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, well, if you look at how many people we've got in the room today, we've got 350 people. Now, you probably wouldn't want to have an English class with 350 students and one teacher, but you could do it with a tool such as this, with an online tool. What you do want to do, I think, if you have a large class, you know, maybe not so many, maybe 50, 100, then you do need to build in those moments for interaction, split them up into breakout groups, send them off into different rooms with clear tasks, go and monitor. If you have different levels of students, then you could either do, you could do several things. You could put a strong student with, you could match strong students with weak students. So the strong students almost become the monitors of the weak students and help them when they're doing that interaction, the groups. Or you could do the other way. You could, if you want to, you could put certain students in one breakout room with one level working on something, and then other students in another room working at something that is a little less taxing. It does seem to be very challenging, though, from the point of view of classroom management, but it's not impossible to do. It just takes a lot of careful planning and preparation.
Okay, thank you very much. I think one last question.
Sure.
Probably later I will also invite Pak Jati and Pak Kom to give your suggestion on this. Some questions were asking about how to maintain students' motivation, because sometimes after a few Zoom meeting, the motivation is going down, or students they were not responsible for their own task, and also they don't want to follow the teacher's instruction. So what do you think about that, Graham?
Yeah, well, a lot of what I said today, I think, was trying to counter that. I think what you have to realize is that keeping students motivated and engaged online is more difficult than face-to-face. First of all, you pick up a lot less online than you do when you're physically in the same room as students. When you're physically in the same room and teaching, you get information from all sorts of different things. You'll get a lot more information from their body language. Maybe you'll overhear certain things. You can sense the energy levels and the atmosphere better of students and react to them, in particular, you know, with teenagers or younger learners. You can't really do that online. So what you need to do is really capture their attention. So you need to do things that they, you know, you need to make the experience feel good to them. They need to feel, just as everybody's, you know, everybody's time, the same is true of students. They need to feel that the time that they're spending with you learning English is time worth spent. They need to be having fun. They need to look forward to your classes. And you need to vary what you do in order for them to feel that way, to motivate. You need to have your energy levels high. You need to be able to engage with them as people. If you know, as far as possible, depending on the numbers of students you have, you do all sorts of things. You need to do the kind of things that you would do in a face-to-face classroom, but do more of it and become very aware of how your teaching is and what you're doing to actually engage the students. What are you doing? Is it interesting? Is it interesting enough for the students to want to come along? Do they feel like it's time well worth, if it's well worth their time to do it? Those are the keys to really motivating students, I think. Just motivating anybody, really. You need to make them feel valued, and that their time is being spent well, really.
Well, thanks a lot. I will call Pak Jati. Would you like to add something, probably more on Indonesian context, how we can motivate students and make them really responsible for their task?
Okay, general tips based on slow internet connection that we have, sometime on and off, because everyone in the city now getting online. Simple tips. One is topics. Teachers should have a lot of selection of topics, variety of topics on that. Keep it short, meaning that the student and the teacher should give instruction short, explanation very short, not too long, with various activities that they can do after the webinar, after the face-to-face. So let them play, let them learn on their own with the guidance of the short instruction from the teacher, and then they report back. So they need a lot of various activities on that. So that's to make the students will want to, okay, I need the teacher to give me more instruction. I need the teacher to give me a lot of games to play, whatever. So keep it that way. A lot of tendency that our teacher right now is to spend, that's what I heard, too long in front of the camera. And if there are 4 kids in the house with 4 Zooms at the same time, that might be a problem. So keep that in mind. Yeah, topic, keep it short, various activities, and they can play outside after the tutorial or the webinar or whatever. Then they report back in the form of like using Padlet or using simple picture, shalala, and simple interactive board. But more time on let them do it on their own. That's my opinion, and hopefully it's useful. Back to you, Finn.
Thank you, Pak Jati. And how about you, Kom?
Excellent advice.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
You might want to respond to some of the questions here.
Okay, Finita, I think, as a lot of people have said, actually, that, and Graham talked about this right at the beginning, that the technology is just a tool for us to be able to communicate and stay in touch, to continue teaching in this time. And we want to make that almost invisible. And I think the point I'd like to make is that good teaching and good pedagogy is the most important part of being a good teacher, not the laptop and not the platform and not the Zoom program that you're using. And we strongly encourage teachers in classrooms and outside classrooms, even through remote teaching, to be as learner-centered as possible and not teacher-centered. So I think if teachers are giving a long lecture online and there's limited opportunities for students themselves to contribute, to speak, to have their moment on the screen themselves, then there's going to be a lot less interaction and a lot less motivation. So the kind of 2 things I would recommend is one, use your on-screen time or your synchronous time to be as interactive as possible. And that is encouraging, students to show pictures, show their work, to speak and to interact, maybe in breakout rooms if you can manage that. And then secondly, I think Joe Dale earlier this week, he gave a very good presentation around sort of simple interactive tools that you can use in your online meetings where you can get people to participate more. So he used quizzes and Mentimeter and Shalala and a lot of these other things which are fun. And that's, it's going to be a lot more motivating because at least I think the students then feel that they are participating, they're acting, that they're contributing to this online lesson. So it's a really interesting question. And I think, again, we will all be learning new techniques and tips about keeping our students motivated. Thanks a lot, Finita. That's all from me. And thanks to Graham, and thanks very much to Pak Jati as well.
Okay, thank you very much, Kom. So I think that's all the questions that I could pose to 3 of you. So I think this is the end of the webinar. Thank you very much for all the participants. Well, for those of you who keep asking about what to do with this online thing, what I can wrap up from all the panelists is that we need to make use of the technology wisely. And when we are using the synchronous communication like Zoom, make sure that we are doing the interaction between the students and the teacher. Is not only the teacher as the talking head, just like what Graham said, that, but we need to build interaction between students and the teachers. Well, thank you so much, Graham, for this very fruitful tips. You give a lot of information for us. Thanks a lot.
A pleasure. Thank you, everybody, for coming, and I hope it's been very useful and interesting to you all. And I hope you have fun and it benefits your remote teaching in the future. Good night from me. Good morning to you all.
Okay, thank you so much. Before you leave, before everybody leave, I would like you to drop your feedback for our webinar by filling out this form as provided here, bit.ly @@_techtalkss3. And then you can also visit our website, iTELL.or.id, and we're going to post the material from Graham and then the recorded version. And also you can check the recorded version of our previous webinar. You can have your time to probably screenshot these links. And also for tomorrow will be our last webinar. And up to now, I think we have 1,100 registrants to this webinar. I think this is one of the biggest webinar ever. We are going to have Daniel from Indonesia, Yogyakarta. He's going to talk about the showcase from offline materials design to simple online classroom management for teachers. I think this is not only suitable for teachers in Indonesia, but also for teachers in South Asia, probably. We might share similar situation. And we'll be waiting for you to register. If you haven't registered, just go to our website, itel.or.id, and you will find the link to the registration form. So once again, thanks again, Graham, for your time. And then thanks Pak Kom, Pak Jati, and everybody for joining this webinar. Good morning from Indonesia and goodbye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Good night to you, Graham, in Mexico. Thanks again. Thanks, Vanita. And goodbye, everybody. We'll see you all again soon. Take care, stay safe, and stay at home.
Yeah, stay safe, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.